Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be diving into what ended up being a thrilling game between the Baltimore Ravens and the Dallas Cowboys. It did not seem that way for a good while there, as the Ravens did jump out to a pretty substantial lead in this game. They were up by 22 points headed into the fourth quarter before the Cowboys made things interesting, and ultimately, again, Ravens do pull this one out by just 3 points, but a lot harder than it had to be. We'll sort of talk about the Ravens and their ability to close out games in a little bit. But really, the story of this game, in my opinion, was the Ravens returning to form, and that was establishing the run game and dominating there. Last season, they were far and away the best rushing offense in the NFL, and it seemed like through the first couple weeks, they didn't really have that same punch to them. Now, a lot of turnover in the running back room played a factor in that. Last year, they were relying on the likes of, J.K. Dobbins didn't play all that much for them, but it was him. It was Gus Edwards. You had Keaton Mitchell, who popped onto the scene for a few weeks there, and those are all guys. Mitchell's still on the roster, but still dealing with that season-ending injury that he had last year. All of them are gone, and then you bring in Derrick Henry. And the thought process is that Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson are going to be an insane two-man combination in that backfield. But John Harbaugh seemed pretty adamant on the idea that they were going to not have Derrick Henry be that very heavy workload running back for them anymore, and that those days of Henry being that are behind him. Well, yesterday showed that he is still very much capable of doing so, where the Ravens as a whole totaled 274 yards on the ground, which is ridiculous. 151 yards from Henry, another 87 from Lamar. You get Justice Hill, who he was averaging 6 yards per carry on limited attempts, but overall, it was an excellent showing. Like I mentioned, Derrick Henry, this was really his first game fully immersed into being a significant part of that Ravens game plan. 25 carries, 151 yards, 2 touchdowns, was involved on a screenplay as well that picked up 23 yards. We got the first Derrick Henry classic stiff arm of planting a defender while in a Ravens jersey. We've seen a number of them in the past, but it was early in the third quarter. It was Kalen Carson, defensive back for the Cowboys. He got a whole face full of Derrick Henry's arm and then saw nothing but turf after that. Just always so much fun to see Derrick Henry sort of it's his version of putting a guy on a poster, is just planting them into the ground. And he capped off that same drive in the third quarter with a 26-yard touchdown there, breaking it out to the outside. So showing off a little bit of acceleration there as well. And I think that is definitely who the Ravens should be hoping to be. They ran the ball 45 times and passed it just 15 times. It's not that Lamar Jackson is not a capable passer, but this has been the recipe for success for Baltimore when they've had their best seasons in these past couple years. It's leaning on the run. And again, Lamar Jackson, I do think, is developed enough as a passer that when you need him to make plays through the air, like he did on that third down on their final drive where he was able to connect with Zay Flowers out on the right to, sort of help seal that game, that he's capable of doing so. But the Ravens play best when they are controlling the time of possession. They're running the ball. They're wearing down the opposing defense. And now you get a bruiser like Derrick Henry that's available to you. That's just something that I think is too good of a recipe to pass up on. Not to mention that there was some noise in the NFL community these past couple weeks, but especially after this past game against the Raiders, about how, the offensive line isn't of the caliber of last year. They lost 3 important starters from last season heading into this year. But I do think that this was, a really good sign for them that for starters, the entire offensive line for the Ravens played the entire game. It was specifically at that right tackle position before Patrick McCarry and Roger Rosengarten were sort of splitting snaps more. I'm not sure if that was due to injury, but I thought that they looked a lot better up front. And it's something that they are going to need to lean on. But as much as this is praise for the Ravens offense, which again, I think that that's the right way to go about it. Shots below the belt in the comment section here says that feels like Lamar Jackson shrinks in big spots. Up to this point, he has. So ultimately, there are still questions to be answered for the Ravens, but at least I feel like they're on the right track. But to the second point of your comment of what's wrong with the Cowboys, for starters, that defense is nowhere near as impactful as I was anticipating it to be. Because, the Ravens, like I mentioned, 274 yards on the ground. That is a bludgeoning. And then you look at last week as well, where the Saints rushed for 190 yards on the ground. And some of that is based off of the game script and the fact that the Cowboys let themselves get into holes early. But and still on the defense, you got to make the stops there. We've seen a number of different defenses in the NFL so far. Just talked about the Chiefs in the last segment. I would argue that the Bears have been kind of screwed over by their offense on a number of occasions, but they still continue to play really good football. That's not an excuse for the Cowboys. You got to set the tone early, and they have just done the opposite of that up to this point, through these first couple games. And we're going to talk about the offense as well, and Dak Prescott, who Dak I thought was, fine. He definitely wasn't great. Some of the throws in the fourth quarter were good, but I thought he was very inaccurate for a lot of the game. But on the defensive side of the ball here still, I do feel like this is kind of to be expected to some degree that they can be pushed around up front. We've talked for a couple of years now the fact that they have been pretty untalented at that linebacker position. During the mid-2010s, that's when you saw a couple of the big-time players for them, Sean Lee, early on, Leighton Vander Esch. But since then, it has been a pretty lackluster linebacking core there for them, and I think that that's really coming apparent. Now, they signed Eric Kendricks in the offseason, which, is an upgrade over what they had, but at this point, Kendricks on the older side, on the latter side of 30, that his best years are sort of seeming to be behind him. They're very reliant on this draft pick from 2023, DeMarvion Overshown, who I wasn't really familiar with him coming into this season. Now, he's somebody that there's a lot of tape out there to feel good about him, but also I still feel like he has a long way to go. He's not fully rounded out as a high caliber linebacker. I feel like he's still not great at the point of attack necessarily. And I think that there's just a very clear way right now to move the ball against that Cowboys defense. Add on top of that as well, that I believe they have allowed just 8 incompletions between the past 2 weeks. Now, part of that, again, game script, the Saints and the Ravens, neither one of them were passing a ton based off of the circumstances of just trying to protect the lead. But the secondary has not really been there yet. Now, Deron Bland is eventually going to come back for them in a few weeks now. That can help shore some things up. But I still think they're going to be vulnerable on the ground. And they are losing the line of trenches battle on both sides of the ball, because the offensive line as well for Dallas has been getting pushed around. Now, this is a tough defensive front in Baltimore, but you are just putting so much in the hands of Dak Prescott right now, who I do think is in that top 10 quarterback conversation. But that being said, it's a fringe top 10 quarterback with really just one wide receiver and not much else going. Now, Jake Ferguson did play in this game. He actually churned out some pretty good results for them. So that's something to at least feel better about moving forward for the Cowboys. But even still, I just feel like they're so one-dimensional, and I don't even know how great that one dimension that they have is, that I think this is a significant problem for them. And I'm not really sure where the reinforcements come from. I mean, you have a name like Brandon Cooks, who caught you a touchdown in week 1 and is, somewhat capable, but not a lot of playmakers on the perimeter. Running back room is very much lackluster, where 16 carries for 51 yards is what they were able to get in this game. The O-line getting pushed around. Left tackle Tyler Guyton, who they drafted in the first round. Again, tough matchup against the Ravens, but I think that Guyton has looked to really be struggling these first handful of weeks, and I'm just not really sure where the next gear comes from for the Cowboys. I suppose it would have to be that defense gets shored up a little bit more and they can start to at least let the Cowboys offense hang around games some more. But you look at the past 3 losses for the Cowboys. We're talking this week against the Ravens, last week against the Saints, and then the other loss coming at home against the Packers in the divisional round or in the wild card round. And I bring those 3 games up, including the playoff game, because it is this weird limbo a little bit in terms of how much criticism can you give to the Cowboys offense. Dak Prescott, you look at the stat line, overall it's fine. 28 for 51. That's not a super high rate, but still threw for 379 yards and 2 touchdowns. But in each of these 3 games that I'm referencing, the defense has just gotten basically smoked out of the gates, and it is so demoralizing. It takes the home crowd out of the game, because all 3 of these recent losses have all been in Jerry World. And ultimately, I think that Dak Prescott is a good quarterback. I stand by that statement, but it is a little bit of a tough ask for him. And also, it's a tough ask for him because it's a tough ask for a lot of quarterbacks to sort of win you a shootout. Now, ultimately, the defense did sort of come around a little bit more in the second half for the Cowboys, but I think it's a tough ask to win a shootout. But that being said, I just don't know if Dak Prescott is totally cut out for that. Like, if you are in a close game, I think he's good enough that he can make big plays and big moments for you. But it's not like he is going to be the type of quarterback that can put the team on his back and carry you through a game where your defense just doesn't show up out of the gates. And that's why you look at the $60 million extension. I have, traditionally been on board with, you just got to bite the bullet and pay the quarterback. If they let Dak Prescott walk after this season, I mean, they have no plan for that offense. That I do think that there are concerns. But you also now look at the fact, well, this is what happens when you pay so much money to a quarterback. You're gonna have a less talented offense around that. Now, also, I think it goes to the front office a little bit, because there's just not that much talent as a whole. Other teams find a way to draft talent and insert them into big enough spots, and Cowboys just really haven't gotten that type of production from all that many players as of late. Obviously, CeeDee Lamb is from, the 2021 class, that he obviously was able to pan out for them. But outside of that, it's 2020 draft, for CeeDee Lamb. But, there just hasn't been really all that much support outside of that. And it's not like they've been heavily invested in free agency, or it doesn't feel like to me that they're mortgaging a ton of draft picks to be able to move up. They just haven't really done a great job of that internal development. You got a couple players on defense, Trayvon Diggs, Deron Bland. Those are nice wins for you. And then I guess a little bit in the front 7 as well, that, you have some contributors, but overall, the lack of superstar talent or not even, because they have superstars. They have specifically CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons. Dak Prescott, wouldn't call him a superstar, but he is a more than capable starting quarterback. Outside of that, it's just getting some of those middling players to fill in the gaps. I don't think the Cowboys have done a good enough job as of late, and it's really costing them. But Let me know your thoughts in the comment section on this one. We are going to be moving on now to a higher note here in what is an undefeated Pittsburgh Steelers team after 3 weeks under the start of Justin Fields. It's been really encouraging to see him sort of find his way back into a prominent spot here. And I want to dive into, the game specifically against the Chargers and just overall where the Steelers are at in terms of the quarterback competition, because Russell Wilson's still out there hoping that he's going to get a shot when he returns from injury. We'll be diving into whether or not that is a realistic possibility and all of other things concerning the Steelers at this point. So we are going to dive into that. But first, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.